Yes, hello. My name is Adam, and I'm giving a talk, The History of iOS App Development, where I will entertain you with exciting tales of what it was like to develop apps way back at the beginning of the App Store and how things have changed over the years since. I know some of you are like me. You've been developing apps for a long time. For you, this should be a fun, nostalgic trip down memory lane. For others who are newer to iOS app development, hopefully there'll be some interesting insights into how things were back in the good old days. Or bad old days. I'm not sure. We'll decide. Exactly. We'll start with the history of me, because, hey, it's my talk. But real quick, again, my name's Adam. I've been developing software since 1993. I started developing apps at the first year of the App Store. My first app, Notemaster, came out that year. Notemaster did not make me rich, but it did well enough that the next year I could quit the day job and try to live the indie developer dream. That lasted for a few years. I did some other apps, not really noteworthy. Finally, in 2013, app sales down. You know, App Store business is hard. So I did what you do. You take on some contract work, a bunch of not even worth mentioning stuff that I worked on that didn't really go anywhere.
Mic real quick.
All right, we're gonna check my mic. Can you hear me still? Cool, then I will continue. But contract work wasn't for me. I finally settled down with a small indie team that makes a suite of productivity apps, time page, actions, and in 2019 we released Flow, which won some nice little Appley awards. Woohoo! Thank you. But in my spare time, I still do other apps, of course, and that brings me to now, 2025. I'm here talking to you at Deep Dish. This is my first Deep Dish. I'm really excited. As you can see, I've been there from the beginning. I've seen some stuff, so I'm here to tell you about it. Let's get started with the history of iOS app development. I'm going to go pretty fast, so let's go. Our tale begins in the Stone Age, also known as 2007. In January of 2007, Apple introduced the iPhone, and the iPhone was released in June of that same year. And between that time, we all wondered, well, what's the deal with developers? Are developers going to be able to make apps for this cool new device? And luckily, in June of that year at WWDC, Steve Jobs got on stage and he told us, yes, indeed, we have a very sweet solution for developers to make apps. And that sweet solution is web apps in Safari. Web apps are fine. But this isn't what we wanted, right? We wanted real apps. We wanted native apps. And so a lot of grumpy developers, a lot of grumpy users. Luckily, Apple changed course just a few months later. Steve made a statement saying, yes, indeed, we are going to have a real native SDK for the iPhone. And before we get to that, though, it's important to point out that even before that, there were some smart developers who figured out how to jailbreak phones and how to reverse engineer all the APIs. And there were some noteworthy apps made during that time. So props to these early pioneers who developed iOS apps before we even had an official SDK. Well, let's talk about that official SDK. There was a special event in March of 2008. Scott Forstall, who many of you remember as the VP of all things related to the iPhone, he got on stage, he told us all about it. He said, hey, this is going to be the same APIs and tools that we use ourselves, which may be mostly true, maybe not 100%. He told us about iPhone OS. Yes, it was iPhone OS back then, not iOS yet. I think this might have been the first time they even gave it a name at all. He told us about the tech stack. It was sort of based on Mac OS. And the most interesting thing of note was UIKit, which they also called Cocoa Touch back then, would be the UI framework that we would have to use. He then told us about the tools, Xcode, interface builder, instruments, and the simulator, the same tools that we use today. And then he did something really cool. Live on stage, he built an app from scratch, a very simple Hello World app, but the idea was just to prove, hey, our tools are so awesome, you can do this very easily. And to further that, they invited some developers on stage who had been given a little sneak peek of the SDK a few weeks before to show off what they had built in a short period of time. After this, though, they brought out the big guns. Steve Jobs, he gets on stage, tells us all about the App Store, and gave a little mock-up, I think, of what it looked like. And he told us that this was going to be the exclusive way that we were going to distribute apps on the platform. And I think this is important, like, to have a little context here, right? Because back then, of course, Apple made personal computers. We all had computers. And computers, you could install software a bunch of different ways, right? You could go to the store and buy something in a box on a disk, or you could download from the internet, or you could program it yourself, open platform. But of course, even back then, we had computer-like devices that were more closed platforms, right? Video game consoles, right? Anyone couldn't just develop for that. There were apps for existing smartphones. Apple's own iPod had apps that you had to buy through Apple. So, maybe we were a little bit surprised because Apple's a computer company, and maybe you could think of the iPhone as a computer, but back then, it was also more of a phone. And so this was surprising, but not a hugely, contentious announcement, I guess. He told us about the deal, the 70-30 split, right? And said this is the best deal going for mobile applications, which at the time was probably true. And then he even told us up front that there would be some limitations in the App Store, that not every type of app would be allowed on the App Store, and that there would be an app review period. And I know, right, the word porn on an official Apple slide, like in an official, it's crazy, right? And then in typical Apple fashion, typical Steve Jobs fashion, he said, oh yeah, this great SDK we just announced, you can go to our website and download it in about an hour, which we all wanted to rush out and do, of course. But before this event ended, this guy, John Doerr from Kleiner Perkins, Cawthon and Byers, it was a venture capital firm, he announced the iFund, this $100 million fund specifically to fund new iPhone apps. And I find this interesting because it really shows that back at the time of this announcement, the App Store was not a sure thing, right? Apple was really going out of their way to really try to sell it and push people on it and trying to even encourage it through funding opportunities. So after this talk, we all went to the website to download the new SDK. It was called the iPhone Dev Center back then. This is an actual screenshot. I don't know which way to point, by the way. Actual screenshot of what it looked like. We downloaded the iPhone OS 2.0 beta SDK. It's so hard to say iPhone OS. It's really annoying. I'll probably mess it up. But for now, excuse me. What was in the SDK? Xcode 3.1. Remember, Xcode was already existed. Mac developers used Xcode to build Mac apps. This is the first version that had ability to build iPhone apps. This screenshot is a real screenshot of Xcode with a real early iPhone app written in good old Objective-C. Yes, Objective-C. Objective-C was the one true language that we had to use. Oh, wow. If I'd known all you have to do is mention Objective-C to get applause, it would be every slide. That was the language everyone used for iPhone development. There was no Swift. Again, Mac developers were used to using Objective-C for building Mac apps, but for those of us like myself that were a little newer to the ecosystem, it was a quirky little language, but we had to use it, so we used it, and we liked it. At least I liked it. I still like it a little bit. Also included in the SDK was Interface Builder. Why am I mentioning this separately? Well, at the time, Interface Builder was a separate app. It was not included in Xcode until Xcode 4, a few years later. And in fact, Interface Builder wasn't even included until the third beta of this first SDK. So when we all were excited and downloaded that very first beta and tried to build our first apps, we were doing all the interface work in code. The first SDK came with frameworks, 18 frameworks, very small number, such a small number that they all fit on one slide. Anyone care to guess how many frameworks are in modern iOS today? Anything? 60? 360 is a good guess. Let me shrink it down a little bit so I can fit them all on the slide. There's 212 frameworks in iOS 18.4. And I've highlighted a few that we use all the time now that were not part of the original SDK, right? Imagine making apps without having access to any of those. And this got me thinking when I was making that slide, it's hard to imagine, but there was a time where, as a developer, you could know everything about iOS development. You could know every framework, and you could be very familiar with all the APIs and strut around WWDC and just be like, yeah, I know everything. It was very cool. Of course, over the years, they've added so much stuff. We can't do that anymore. In fact, I don't even have time to watch all the WWDC videos. Has anyone had this where you find a new API one day accidentally and you're really excited about it, and then you look and go, oh my God, that was actually released like 5 years ago, just because you missed it and you're like sad that you went all that time without it. So, but back then, you could feel really smart. How did we learn to make apps? Well, the Developer Center website was the primary place. It had great sample code and great documentation. And one of the other reasons it was the primary place is that the whole developer program was under NDA. The developer agreement, all of the APIs, all the SDKs, you were not supposed to talk about it. I don't think anyone got in trouble, but it still kind of stifled discussion. Nevertheless, there were still some third-party external places that you could learn about the SDK. Forums. I want to call it the Mac Rumors forums. I don't know if you know macrumors.com. I don't know if you know they have forums, and within the forums they have a sub-forum for developers. This was a place where we all went, one of the prime places where developers back at this time were talking about the new SDK and helping each other out. And in fact, if you really are interested, if you go to Mac Rumors forums today, they still have every thread and every post since the very beginning of their forums, and you can search for that little time period, early 2008, and you can see yourself exactly what developers were discussing back then. There were some tutorial sites, but nothing like we have today, where like there's dozens and dozens of Swift tutorial sites. And there were some blogs, but there were no blogs like about iOS development, really. It was more like a developer who wants to talk a little bit about what they're doing. There was a developer program that you could join, just like it's the same thing, $99 a year, just like we have now. One of the key differences is that back then, that was the only way to get code running on an actual physical iPhone. Now I think there's a way you can do it for free, but back then you had to join the program, and so we all wanted to join the program, but not all of us got in. Many of us, including myself, got an email like this that basically says, hey, we have limited availability of developers we can accept, and please be patient. I think they just didn't expect that much interest, and I think they were still approving developers as part of this really manual process, and so they were learning how it went. I have a special segment. I was talking about annoying things, right? So here's a very special segment. I'm going to talk about more annoying things we used to have to deal with, but don't anymore, during the beta period especially. Limited memory. Those first couple iPhones had very little RAM, right? 128 megabytes of RAM, less than 100 megabytes available to apps. It was hard to fit your apps in that RAM, and guess what? If you hit the limits, the system would just kill your app. I mean, it would give you a little bit of a warning before it did so. It would call this method, and you could free up memory, but what are you going to free up? Who knows? It was just something we had to deal with. And speaking of memory, manual memory management was the only mode that Objective-C worked with. And for those of you who don't know what that means, just real briefly, it meant if you had allocated an object, you had to either tell the system, you had to call retain on it, telling the system that you wanted to hold on to it, or release it to let the system free it up when they could. It wasn't that hard, but it was just annoying and very error prone. Signing certificates and provisioning profiles. So this was a 100% manual process. It was automatic back then. It's automatic mostly now. But say you just wanted to get code on a new device, you'd have to go to Keychain Access and create a signing certificate request, upload it to the portal, generate a signing certificate, download it back into Keychain Access, take the UUID off your device, upload that to the developer portal, manually regenerate a provisioning profile, download it manually, install it into Xcode, and then, if you were very, very, very lucky, you'd be able to run some code on your iPhone. I know I'm complaining a lot in this section, and if it seems like I'm just a grumpy old man complaining about walking uphill in the snow, it's because I am. Let's get back to the betas. I need a drink of water. The first SDK had 8 betas. Guess what? They were called Beta 1 through Beta 8. Beta 8 took us to June of 2008. That was WWDC. This was the first one to sell out. It was also The first one with iPhone sessions. Apple gave us some stats. 250,000 people had downloaded the free SDK. 25,000 had applied to the developer program, but only 4,000 had actually made it in because, again, of that backlog of accepting developers. At the same WWDC, Scott Forstall told us about something new that was not actually part of the original SDK, but was going to come soon, push notifications. And one noteworthy thing is when he was talking about this, if you watch it, like he's kind of pushing it as a way of working around the lack of multitasking, right? Because back then, iOS didn't have any multitasking. You close the app, the system kills the app. So this was kind of pitched as a way of letting an app still communicate with you in some way when it was not running. They promised it for just later that September, but this was a big lie. It was delayed. I'll tell you more about that. Also at WWDC, Steve formally kind of announced iPhone OS 2.0 to the general public, along with the new iPhone 3G. Yes, iPhones used to be announced at WWDC in June. We'd get the SDKs in March, but June is when it would actually be released. It wasn't until the 4S that they moved to September. And he announced that all this would be out on July 11th, which was important because this was the first time that developers had a date of when your apps would have to be ready to hit the App Store that very first day. And let's talk about the App Store that first year. Day one, it was actually released a day early on July 10th, over 500 apps. 2 weeks later, 10 million app downloads. How did developers get their apps noticed back then? Well, there was a special list, which I don't think we have today anymore, the new app list. And every single new app, if you just released a new app, it would appear at the top of the new app list. And as new apps came in, it would get knocked down, but there weren't that many new apps happening that fast. And so you would get a big download boost for being on this list. Because back then, users were app crazy, right? Everyone was talking about apps, checking out the App Store every day, what's new, what's new, what's new. And so you would just get this natural, very large app download boost just by releasing an app. It was very cool. Another way of getting noticed was in the press, which of course is the same today, except that, again, back then, it was app mania. Everyone was talking about apps. Everyone wanted to ask people, like, what are the latest apps I should check out? And all the press wanted to write about apps. There was like most tech blogs had a Friday best apps of the week sort of section. So it was just novel to have an app back then. And so it was a little easier to get noticed in that way. Top charts. We still have top charts now, but back then, probably even more important, because again, everyone's checking the App Store all the time. The top charts, both paid and free, based on downloads. And if you could get in the top charts, you were golden. Let's talk a little bit more about that kind of thing in another special segment, a brief history of App Store business models. Thank you. I'm excited about it. Back in the beginning, you could distribute your apps only two ways, paid up front or free. It was beautiful, it was pure, it was simple, no in-app purchase, no freemium, no subscriptions. If you had a paid app, especially the first few months, you might have a fairly high-ish price. That changed pretty quickly, though, because developers were really keen on getting on those top charts, and they figured out ways to kind of game the system a little bit, and rightfully figured out you make your app cheaper, you get more downloads, you get higher on the charts, you get higher on the charts, you get more downloads, you get more money. It was awesome, and so pretty much the so-called race to the bottom began, and paid up-front apps pretty much plummeted right down to about 99 cents. Another way, this was a brief window of time, another way to game the charts, if you had a paid app, was you'd have a paid app, you make it free for a couple days. And while it was free, you'd get tons of downloads, right? Because everyone's downloading every free app. Then you switch it back to paid, and guess what? Your ranking on the paid charts takes into account the free downloads. So for a little bit of time, you're suddenly rocketed to the paid charts just by making your app free. Apple did eventually kind of figure this out and put a stop to it, but it was beautiful while it lasted. I couldn't get through this talk without mentioning a very infamous app, which sounds like a lot of you remember. For those of you who don't know, this is an app called I Am Rich. It was a paid app that was set to the highest price tier possible, $1,000 US, and all this app did was show this picture of this red ruby with a little inspirational mantra. It was a gimmick. The whole gimmick was, I am rich enough to pay $1,000 for an app that doesn't do anything other than show off how rich I am. This became infamous because all the press was writing about it, everyone was talking about it. Apple did eventually make the developer take it down, but I did a little research. Apparently the developer, wait, you're not here, right? The developer did get eight purchases and 2 refunds, so $6,000 before Apple's cut. Not bad for what I hope is just a day's work. I shouldn't assume that. Free apps. Just because you had a free app doesn't mean you couldn't make money, because almost immediately the world of mobile ads exploded. AdWorld, wait, did I get that right? Sorry, I can't. AdWorld was one of the early SDKs you could get. I think it was maybe the first native SDK for ads. AdWorld was almost immediately bought by AdMob, who you've probably heard of because they were then bought by Google, who still uses the AdMob brand today. And somewhere between paid and free apps was the era of light versions of apps. The idea was if you had a paid version of an app, one of the problems was it was hard to get people to try out your app, right? They would have to pay just to be able to download it. So you would create a separate version that was free called the light version, where there'd be some limitations. When users hit the limitations, you could upsell them to the paid version. And basically freemium before we had in-app purchase to do real freemium. And the word light was used all the time, specifically because other words like demo or trial, Apple did not like. They would reject you. I think it was because it implied an expiration of features. So somehow light always passed the test, and everyone used that. Of course, once we had in-app purchase, we didn't have to do this anymore. And in-app purchase came 2009 with iOS 3.0. It was done. Sorry, this is not the, I keep thinking it's WWDC. This was the March SDK release announcement. One thing people forget about is the first version of in-app purchase was for paid apps only. Free apps could not use in-app purchase. I think the idea was you had a game that cost money, but then people could purchase add-on levels or something. Apple also kind of thought, well, free should remain free. It was like a keep things simple. But of course, that did not last long. Just a few months later, they just put out an announcement saying, oh yeah, now you can do it for free apps. And thus, the whole freemium business model exploded and kind of changed everything very quickly. Nowadays, I think paid upfront apps are very, very rare. Almost everyone is doing some version of trials or freemium-ish things. In 2011, a new business model, subscriptions. But these are not the subscriptions you're looking for. This was a special version of subscriptions that was just for content-based apps like magazines or video. Most of us didn't have apps like that, so you could kind of just think that was a little novelty. We didn't care too much. The real subscriptions came in 2016, available for all apps. I think it was the first time that there was any deviation on the 70-30 split, 85-15 after the first year. And this was the first time we had any real good way of doing any sort of time-based trial. Apple really hated anything that expired before this, but of course, subscriptions naturally expire, so they built trials into it. And that was 2016, and nothing really has changed in the App Store since then. Unless you count everything that happened early last year in the European Union, in which case, who knows what's going to happen. Up is down, down is up, left is right, it's all crazy. I'll let someone else do a history talk on that in the future, because I don't think we know how it's all going to shake out. Let's go back to the main timeline. March of 2009, iOS 3.0 was announced. With it, as I mentioned, in-app purchase, also push notifications got delayed a full year till this time. Apple gave us some stats about the App Store because people were talking about the app review process. 96% of apps submitted are approved. Cool. 98% of apps are approved in 7 days or less. Wait, they're bragging about 7 days or less? Yes, that was the review time average back then. We didn't know any better. Let's talk a little bit more about that kind of thing in another special segment called A Brief History of App Store Review and Guidelines. I know, it just keeps getting better, right? Yes, at the beginning, 7 days on average. But it was even worse. It was inconsistent. Sometimes it was 3 days. Sometimes it was 20 days. Why? Who knows? There's a big black box in the sky, and we just, lived in its world. What about App Store Review Guidelines? Oh, there were no App Store Review Guidelines. Or at least there was no document called the App Store Review Guidelines. In the developer agreement, there were some statements about apps you couldn't make, but that whole thing was under NDA, so we couldn't even talk about that. Human interface guidelines, but that's for interface. It was all a lot of guesswork and luck. And I know some of you are saying, but Adam, it's still guesswork and luck. No, trust me, it's so much better now. It was so much worse back then. Even the first year, there were some highly publicized App Store rejections. That never happens now, though, right? But most of the stories around this were around the fact that it's just that developers had no clue what the rules were. It's like, we'll apply the rules, we just don't know exactly what they are. And that took a little bit of time to sort out, but finally in 2010, Apple did release App Store Review Guidelines, detailed guidelines like we have now. I mean, it's still Apple, so a little vague, you know. And this was the first time we could do the thing where we can appeal to a review board. Before that, we had to just stare at the black box in the sky and say, why? Let's see, this was kind of the status quo for a few years, but finally in 2016, Phil Schiller rode into town and took over all things related to the App Store and App Store Review. And almost immediately, improved app review times about 1 day, just like we have now. Very, very nice. They also updated the app review guidelines around this time, and to kind of commemorate it, they published a special version of the guidelines in the form of a digital comic book. This is really cool. They hired some comic book artists to make story panels, but all of the talk bubbles are just the literal text of the App Store Review Guidelines. So you could just read the guidelines in that form. This is really cool. You should check it out. At the end of my talk, I'll have a link to a PDF where you can read this for yourself. Be careful. It's old guidelines. Don't follow the guidelines. Just read the comic. Let's go back to the timeline. 2010, the iPad was announced. Woohoo! I'm not counting the iPod Touch when I say this. It was the first new device type that still used iPhone OS. And yes, it was still called iPhone OS even at the beginning of the iPad. iPhone OS 3.2 was the special version. They announced this in January. It was 60 days later that they released the iPad. And this was the first time we had that experience where, Apple announces a piece of hardware, lets developers download an SDK, run stuff in the simulator, but we can't use the hardware for several months later. We get it at the same time as everyone else. And the first time this happened, I think a lot of developers felt very, very uneasy about this, so they tried to find solutions to figure out, what would it be like to actually have my app run on this device that we don't have. And so we would do things like create these cardboard mock-ups of iPads that we could hold in our hands to kind of see what that would be like. I don't think anyone does this now. I didn't see any, Vision Pro cardboard mock-ups, right? You were not supposed to see that. Good thing this isn't being live streamed. Apple pushed us to port our iPhone apps to the iPad, introduced the idea of universal apps that let us, we still have this today, buy the app on one platform, get it on all the other platforms. But in the very early days, a lot of developers released separate iPad versions because we wanted more money. We wanted to pay for the cost of porting it, right? I chose the Angry Birds example here because it has the letters HD on the icon, which was a very common way, especially in games, to kind of just designate that this is the iPad version. I mean, you couldn't say iPad on the icon, so we all knew what this meant. So a couple ways to port your app. Of course, there was a third way, which was to not port it at all and have your iPhone app run in this stupid emulation layer, which I'm still grumpy about because they never let us opt out of it, and we're still stuck with it even today. Since the iPad was the first new device with a totally different screen size, that gives me a good segue into another special segment called A Brief History of iOS Screen Sizes and Layout. Some people like layout. 2008, we had the iPhone. It was beautiful. It had one screen size, 320 by 480 points. It was also 320 by 480 pixels because pixels were points. One screen size. It was beautiful. That's all we had to worry about. We could do, if we wanted to put something on the screen, we could just do it statically. Just put it at the coordinates you want to. Why bother worrying about anything else? There's only one screen size. We did have in UIKit springs and struts, so you could try to do something a little more adaptive, but why bother? It's only one size, right? I mean, there was landscape, right? That's kind of another size, but it's turned on its side. And I swear, lots of code bases back then, just if landscape, do this layout, if portrait, do this other layout, right? And this was the status quo for 5 years. The first 5 iPhones, the first 4 iPod Touches, not counting, sorry, I'm behind a slide. I'm not counting Retina because it's still the same screen size in terms of points. Meanwhile, back in Android land, right, every new phone a slightly different resolution. And we just pointed and laughed. You guys are so silly with your multiple screen sizes. 2010, though, as I said, iPad, finally a new screen size. But even back then, you know, code, if iPad, do this special layout. If iPhone, do this other special layout. Still just very static layout, conditionally applied. The first new iPhone with a new screen size was the iPhone 5. Same width, though, just a little bit taller, so you could kind of cheat. And I saw lots of code with, if screen size greater than 480, do this special thing, you know. It's probably around this time the Android guys were laughing at us, right? Because they're like, people, we figured this out a while ago. What's with all this weird static layout? Apple did introduce auto layout a year later, which was a way of not specifying the coordinates of things, but rather specify the constraints against other views. We still use this today in UIKit, for those of you who still know what UIKit is. Auto layout was great, it worked great, it did its job, but still a little unwieldy, hard to work with. Many of us did and still saw error messages like this in the logs. It was iOS 8 that year at WWDC, Apple really started pushing what they were calling adaptive layouts. Apple told us, stop, your code should not care about orientation. Your code should not care about if it's on an iPhone or an iPad. All your code should care about is that it's running in some sort of container of some sort of shape and size, and you should just adapt to that. And they introduced size classes to kind of help us out with that. And many of us, you know, saw this and thought, that's interesting. Why are they pushing this so hard? Maybe Apple's giving us a big hint about something coming very soon. And we were right, because it was that September that Apple introduced the iPhone 6 and the 6 Plus, two screens that were bigger than what came before and also different from each other. It was really around this time that I noticed developers really saying, maybe I should really start adapting, use auto layout, create these, or use these adaptive strategies and get rid of my static code. And we certainly did it then when the iPad added multitasking, because, I mean, you know, when you're in slide over mode on the iPad, it's tall and thin like an iPhone. If you have code that's like if iPad, it doesn't even make any sense. Of course, today we have SwiftUI, and SwiftUI has adaptive layout really built into its core. It's actually hard to do like a statically placed something in SwiftUI, right? It's more difficult. So we have that, and things are a lot easier. And nowadays, I didn't even show all the different screen sizes because there's too many to count. I really did try, but really, seriously, like every new iPhone, if you pay attention, is like 2 pixels wider than the previous one, and we don't care anymore because we all have adopted adaptive layout. So let's move back to the main timeline. We moved on to the Middle Ages of iOS development. iOS 4, finally. Not iPhone OS anymore. iOS 4 came out at the same time, or same year, Apple introduced the iPhone 4, which had a Retina display, which meant that we all had to update our apps to have Retina resolution assets, you know, with the @2x. This was a little disruptive at the time, right? Because a lot of people had just built pixel by pixel exactly what they wanted in Photoshop at that exact resolution. We didn't have, like, you know, vector things. We didn't have SF symbols, right? So a lot of us had licensed icons from some third-party pack, and maybe that person was long gone, and we had to suddenly update our apps with new icons. So a little bit disruptive. We got through it. But speaking of disruptive, 2013, iOS 7, the great flattening. I think this was the most disruptive thing. I think this is the most disruptive thing to happen to developers in the history of iOS app development. The OS went from looking like iOS 6 to iOS 7. All the apps changed from the so-called skeuomorphic look, where we had our textures and our gradients and our shadows, to the flat look on the right. And regardless of what you think about this aesthetically, we all have our opinions. The fact of the matter is, at this time, when iOS 7 came out, very quickly amongst users and the public, the version on the left was considered old and crusty and out of date, and apps that looked like the one on the right, were considered modern and sleek, and your users wanted you to update your apps, and they wanted it immediately. It was a big change that you were kind of expected to deal with all at once. That's why I say it was so disruptive. Now, if you use standard controls, maybe it wasn't that hard, right? The OS would kind of give it to you automatically. But if you had an app where you had painstakingly spent the time to embrace the previous style and had done your little gradients and shadows, you were pretty much redesigning your app. And I can't overstate how disruptive this is. I can only pray and hope that we never, ever, ever have to go through anything like this ever again. We'll see, we'll see. Speaking of disruptive things, 2014, something happened. Swift, that's right, Swift came. New programming language, Objective-C, you don't have to use that anymore. Use Swift. Swift brought with it a modern syntax. It brought with it a type safety, and it brought with it endless debates on the Swift evolution forums about pointless programming language, nitpicky stuff. I'm not bitter. And of course, Swift led to something else, Swift UI. Entirely new way of developing UI. I think not everyone is able to use Swift UI, but I think we all at least want to. We hope that we can do that. And wow, we're in 2019, so we're already in the modern age. Don't ask me why I use Baby Yoda. I did this talk for my wife, and she said, you should use Baby Yoda. And I go, okay. But you know what? This is a history talk, so we're not even going to cover the modern age, because we'll let someone else in the future talk about that. But let's talk about the future, maybe, before I wrap up, because after all, we think we're here on the timeline, but 20 years from now, we'll be way back there on the timeline. And so maybe we can think of what things might happen in the future during that 20-year period of time. Well, I'll give you my opinion. I can't tell the future for real, so I can't tell you what's really going to happen, but maybe I can tell you what I think will be important to developers in the future. And to do that, I can think about what things I think have been important to developers in the past, as well as all the time since then. So I came up with 3 ideas. The first is creating awesome apps, right? As we talked about, back in the early days, things were very limited. There was very few types of apps you could make. And instead of complaining about it, we just focused on doing the best we could with what we had. Just focus on making the best apps you can with what you have. And I think that will continue to be the case in the future. Trying new opportunities. As we've seen, Apple's constantly creating new frameworks that let you add new types of features you couldn't before. In some cases, new types of apps you could never create before, as well as new business models, new ways of possibly making a go at making a living on your apps. And I think, at least what I've seen, is that the developers who embrace this, developers who jump on these things, you know, like it's a way to move forward and to, you know, it leads to success. Maybe not all the time, but I think maybe another way of saying it is don't do the opposite. Don't be afraid of new things, right? We see new things come out. It's like, I did that, right, with one of my apps. It was like, freemium. I'm never going to do freemium. That's so, you know, that's so sketchy, right, in the early days, and totally regret it. And third, making your own luck. This one's a little more wishy-washy, maybe. You know, we've seen lots of developers be very successful, and it's easy to say, that's so cool, they got so lucky, you know. But I think it's a kind of luck you can kind of make. You know, you can look at the world and decide, you know, what are things that I think people will get excited about? What are some app ideas that I can tell a good story about? What are some app ideas that maybe Apple would be very interested in at this time to feature? What are some app ideas that the press might want to run with? Not that you have to like follow trends, but I guess my point is not that you can make your own luck, but I think there's things you can do to increase the odds of you getting lucky, I guess. And on that, hopefully inspirational note, we've reached the end of my talk. Again, my name is Adam. The best way to reach me is on Mastodon. And this link here is a link to a shared Dropbox folder that has a whole lot of goodies, such as the that comic book app review guidelines, as well as a lot of the original PDFs of the original SDK 2.0 documentation and sample things. And so everyone have a great deep dish. Thank you so much.
Are burning bright down on Michigan Avenue. Techies gather, hearts ignited, caffeinated fuel, code and chaos, demos blast, the vibe is something wild. Deep dish calls, Chicago's pulse beats louder than a child. Deep dish revolution, innovation in the air. Ideas rise like skyscrapers, tech dreams everywhere. From the Loop to Navy Pier, the future's on display. Deep dish brings the fire to the windy city's day. Lines of code like pizza toppings stacked up to the sky. Debugging while the skyline sparkles, catch up questions why. Every glitch a battle cry, every crash a dare. In the room you feel the magic, every bite will share. Deep dish revolution, innovation in the air. Ideas rise like skyscrapers, tech dreams everywhere. From the Loop to Navy Pier, the future's on display. Deep dish brings the fire to the windy city's day. So grab your laptop, grab your voice, it's time to make it loud. Pitch your vision to the pack, stand tall and draw the crowd.